Great, so chapter 5 is energy, and we're going to be talking about how you get from the sun to you, as you can see here. So we're going to be starting with solar energy and then moving through the organisms that take that energy and turn it into chemical energy, and then how do we take that chemical energy and turn it into usable energy. So all energy flows from the sun and then through life on Earth. Now, there is an exception, and I will post a video on this. We have found that there are organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean in hydrothermal vents, and those hydrothermal vents provide heat, but more importantly, chemicals in the form of things like sulfur. So take a look at that video, and you can see what kinds of organisms are using that form of energy. We're going to be talking about energy conversions, going from that sun into a form that organisms can use. We're going to be looking at the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The organisms you'll see in that video on hydrothermal vents, they're going to be using what we call chemosynthesis. It's along the lines of photosynthesis, but they use chemicals instead of light to create those chemicals like sugars and proteins and so forth. So we're going to be looking at these two processes. So these are the two steps from sun to us, usable energy. So we're going to be looking at the process of photosynthesis, taking that solar energy and turning it into chemical bonds. And then cellular respiration, taking that chemical energy and turning it into fuel. And you'll see here, we're going to talk about this when we get to cellular respiration, but both plants and animals and fungi and all those other organisms use cellular respiration. But before we can talk about the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we need to talk about energy, because you can see we're going to be transferring solar energy into chemical energy and then taking that chemical energy and turning it into fuel. So we're going to be talking about energy in its two different forms, kinetic energy and potential energy. But before we get into the difference between kinetic energy and potential energy, let's talk about what energy is. So energy is just the capacity to do work, and work is moving matter against opposing forces. So this would be things like being able to lift, materials. So we usually think about the capacity to do work as far as big stuff. But on the level of a cell, this could just be the capacity to do work, moving a material from one side of the cell to the other. So energy is the way that the cells are going to do that. So the energy is their ability to move material around in the cell or to move the cell itself. All right, but we still need the energy to do that. So we've got kinetic energy and potential energy. And kinetic energy is commonly referred to as the energy of moving objects. Kinetic means to move. So if kinetic energy is the energy of moving objects, can you think of an example of kinetic energy? What's an example of, the energy of a moving object? And there's lots of different ways you can describe that. All right, so let's take a look at some of the examples I came up with. Some of them may be similar to what you came up with. So these are ones that I've got. So kinetic energy, like I said, the energy of moving objects. So things like bicycles, you running, animals flying or running. But also, we don't think about the fact that heat energy is kinetic energy. So think about a fire, right? That heat moves off of that fire. So that is kinetic energy, as well as light energy. So the light from the sun or the light from a light bulb, that's kinetic energy because the light and we'll talk about this when we get a little farther into photosynthesis, the light waves are actually moving. And so it is a type of kinetic energy. So we've got kinetic energy, which is the energy of moving objects. And then we've got potential energy. So what does it mean to have potential energy? And it's the opposite. It's the energy of stored energy, right? So this is the capacity to do work that results from the location or position of an object. We often think about things like water behind a dam, or like if you're riding a bike and you're up at the top of a hill, that's potential energy because you have the potential to turn it into kinetic energy once you start going down. Or if you're holding, for example, like, well, of course I don't have a ball sitting on my desk, but if you had like a ball or, even, well, I do have this little die. When you hold an object up in the air, it has potential energy now because once you drop it, it will turn into kinetic energy because it will be a moving object, right? But food has potential energy as well. And the food has the potential energy in the chemical bonds. So the bonds between carbon and hydrogen, for example, have a lot of energy in them. And so we can break these bonds and turn them into kinetic energy, energy we can use. So something like an apple, or really any food that you eat, those chemicals inside them, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats, they all contain chemical bonds, which is potential energy, right? So potential energy has the potential, the ability, the capacity to do work, but it's just waiting due to it being locked up into those chemical bonds, or because of its location, position, if it's up high, something like that. So here we've got the two different options of kinetic energy versus potential energy. And so you can see some other examples, like I said, water behind a dam, or somebody up at the top of the hill. They're just getting ready to turn that potential energy into kinetic energy. So those are the two types of energy. So we're going to be seeing, as we go through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, a change from potential energy to kinetic energy, or a change from kinetic energy to potential energy. Right? Now the thing is that every time we go from one to the other, so if we take potential energy and turn it into kinetic energy, something happens. And that is, every time we do that, the amount of energy available to do work is going to decrease. So every time we take, for example, that sunlight and capture it and turn it into chemical energy, the amount of energy that's available is going to go down. So we don't get all of that energy that's coming in as sunlight. So what is going on? Why is that the case? So let's take a look. So of all of the energy that comes in from the sun, only about 1% of it released by the sun is captured and converted by plants into chemical energy, into potential energy. So what happens to the other 99%? Where does the other 99% of the energy go from the sun, right? So we've got all the sunlight that comes in, and only 1% of it gets captured and converted into chemical energy by plants via photosynthesis. Where does the other 99% go? So probably if you caught it here in the picture, you may have said heat. And yeah, a good chunk of that 99% is going to get transformed into heat. Some of it is going to get transformed into heat by the plant itself, but also a lot of this energy is transformed into heat by the planet, right? So not all the energy makes it to the planet, but the energy that does make it to the planet, a lot of it is going to get absorbed by the water, the soil, and so forth, and turned into heat. If it doesn't get absorbed, it gets reflected as heat. This is actually what helps warm our planet up. All right. And the same thing happens when we eat. All right. You can see here. So we actually take that chemical energy and we store it, but then when we go to use it, we're going to turn a lot of it into heat, and only a little bit of it is going to get turned into the actual kinetic energy to move us. All right. So why is this? We're going to talk a little physics. Right? So yeah, it's biology, but you've seen we've already talked some chemistry. Now we're going to talk some physics. And so the physics we're going to talk about is thermodynamics. And so this is the study of transformation of energy from one type to another. So what happens when we go from kinetic to potential, or potential to kinetic, right? So the first law of thermodynamics, we're just going to talk about two of them, right? So this is the one that says that energy can never be created or destroyed, right? So you can't just get free energy from somewhere, and you can't make it go away. What happens to it is it changes from one form to another. So that form is going to be that, you're taking it from kinetic energy to potential energy, or potential energy to kinetic energy, but it doesn't necessarily turn into the form that you want, right? So when you turn it into kinetic energy, like when you eat something, yeah, you're going to turn it into kinetic energy to make your muscles work, but a good amount of it is not going to be turned into kinetic energy to make your muscles work. It's going to be turned into kinetic energy as heat energy, okay? So you can change it from one form to another, but you can't make any new energy. You can just move it from one type to another. All right. So that's the first law. You can't create or destroy. You can just change it from one form to another. The second law is what explains what happens to it and how we lose useful energy. So the second law of thermodynamics says that every conversion of energy includes transformation of some of that energy into heat. And so this is why very little of the sunlight that comes in is going to get converted into chemical energy by plants, and why very little of the food that we eat gets turned into useful energy. So think about like a car, right? There's a reason why I put a car here. So when you drive a car, when you get out after you've been driving and you put your hand on the hood of the car, what does it feel like? It's hot, right? Why is it hot? It's hot because you've been burning fuel, gasoline, diesel, whatever it is that you've been burning, and majority of it is going to get turned into heat. Comparatively, very little of it is going to be used to make the wheels turn and make the car go, right? And related to what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, heat is almost completely useless to living organisms. Right? We actually, you may have noticed, release heat all the time. We use heat to maintain our body temperature, but we're releasing it all the time. That's why we feel warm, right? And we have heat coming off of us. It's because we release the extra heat out into the atmosphere, right? So that is the physics part, talking about energy and so forth. There's one other section to talk about before we can start talking about photosynthesis. And that is the molecule we're going to see in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. ATP, these guys are rechargeable batteries that live in our cells. Okay? So these are little molecules that float around that get charged up with the energy that is made during these different processes. All right? So why do we need them? The thing is that cells can't use light energy, so light from the sun, or chemical energy from our food directly to use to do work. So it's just like your electronics. So like your laptop or your cell phone, they can't use the electricity directly from the wall. You need to store it in a battery. And so the same thing for your cells. You need to take that energy from the light or your food and put it into a battery so that then your cells can use it. Right? So we need to convert it into ATP. Right? So what is ATP? Well, ATP is this guy right here. And this might look a little familiar. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. The A is the same A from DNA, right? Remember you had A, T, C, and G? Well, this is the A from that A, T, C, and G. It's just that your cells have added 2 phosphate groups because this adds energy. Right? So you can store energy. You can see there's little high energy bonds when you add extra phosphates. So in your DNA, there aren't 3 phosphates, just 1. But if you add extra phosphates, it allows extra energy to be stored. And so whenever you see ATP, you'll see it looks all charged up, right? Whenever you use ATP, to get energy, so you can see here, we're going to get the energy out. Your cells do that by breaking off this end phosphate, okay? That releases the energy from this bond and turns it into this guy right here, ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And it's okay for you to know them as ATP and ADP, all right? But this guy doesn't have a charge anymore. You can see he's not charged up. And ADP is going to look like ATP only without the excited charge around it. And that's because this is a battery without any charge anymore. All right, so this is the charged up battery. This is the drained battery. And so the way your cells use this ATP, we've got our drained battery and the phosphate hanging out. Well, some of the energy from your food is going to be released and used to charge them up, stick them together, and charge the battery. Then that ATP will be sent somewhere in the cell where the energy is needed. It will break apart. The battery will be uncharged again, so it'll be dead, right? And then the whole thing will be started over. So this will get sent to be charged back up, and then this will get sent out. It'll get used, sent back, over and over and over again, right? And the cool thing about this versus our normal rechargeable batteries is ATP can be recycled hundreds of thousands of times as a battery before it has to be disassembled and new ATP is made. The one downside to ATP is that it doesn't stay charged for very long if it's not being used. And you need a lot of it. So we actually have enough in our bodies that if we stopped charging it, we'd only have enough energy for a couple of seconds. So we have to constantly keep recharging the ATP. But we have the mechanisms that we'll talk about here in future lectures on photosynthesis and cellular respiration on how we're going to charge this guy up. Right?